The planet of Aegis, located in the Orion arm of the galaxy, had always been a beacon of peace and unity. Its atmosphere shimmered with an ethereal blue hue that could be seen from light years away. For centuries, it had served as a neutral ground for interstellar negotiations, its serenity untouched by the wars and conflicts that ravaged other parts of the cosmos. But now, that tranquility was under threat. A vast armada of starships hovered in the sky, casting ominous shadows over the once peaceful world below. These ships, vast beyond imagination, floated silently in low orbit, their engines thrumming with latent power. The lead vessel, Eos Primarch, was the crown jewel of the fleet, a battlecruiser designed for war but now repurposed for what could be the most critical negotiation in galactic history. Admiral Selim stood on the observation deck of the Eos Primarch, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the planet below. His face, weathered by years of command, betrayed no emotion, though the weight of his responsibility bore heavily upon him. The admiral's silvered hair was neatly cropped, and his uniform, a deep midnight blue, gleamed with medals from countless campaigns. His posture was as rigid as the steel of his starship, but inwardly, his thoughts churned with concern. "Admiral, the delegation is ready," said a voice behind him. Selim turned slightly to face his aide, Commander Lyra Thorne. Thorne was a capable officer, sharp-minded and unwaveringly loyal, her uniform pressed to perfection, her brown hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes, bright with intelligence, held a flicker of uncertainty, a mirror of the Admiral's own concealed fears. "Good," Selim said, his voice measured. "And the enemy fleet?" "They're holding their position at the outer edge of the system," Thorne replied. "Still no sign of aggression. But we've detected their long-range scanners probing our defenses." Selim exhaled slowly. "Typical. They're testing our resolve." The Admiral turned back to the viewport, his eyes narrowing. The enemy, the Dominion of Zalor, had long coveted Aegis. Its resources, its strategic location, and its neutral status made it a prize beyond measure. And now, after years of Cold War posturing, the Zalor had finally made their move. Under the guise of peace talks, they had sent their fleet to orbit the planet, just as the Galactic Union had sent theirs. But this was no mere diplomatic maneuver. The fleets were too large, too heavily armed. This was the prelude to something far more sinister, an inevitable clash of titanic forces. "Have the Zalor delegation arrived yet?" Selim asked, his voice a low rumble. "Not yet," Thorne said, "but they are expected within the hour." Selim nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation that awaited them. The Zalor were a race known for their duplicity. Their empire, sprawling and militaristic, had expanded over the centuries through conquest, absorbing countless worlds into their autocratic regime. The Galactic Union, on the other hand, was an alliance of free worlds, united by common ideals of democracy and cooperation. The two factions had been at odds for as long as anyone could remember. This meeting on Aegis was supposed to be a final attempt at diplomacy, a way to avert all-out war. But Selim had little faith in words. He knew the Zalor all too well. They respected only strength. "Admiral," Thorne began hesitantly, breaking into his thoughts. "Do you think they'll honor the negotiations this time? Or is this just a ploy to gauge our defenses?" Selim turned away from the window, his expression grim. "It doesn't matter what they intend. What matters is that we're prepared for anything. If the Zalor want a fight, we'll give them one." Thorne nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. She knew as well as anyone that a full-scale war with the Zalor would be catastrophic. Entire star systems would burn. Millions would die. The tension in the fleet was palpable. Every officer, every soldier aboard the Eos Primarch and the hundreds of other ships in the Union fleet felt the weight of the coming conflict. There was a shared understanding that this could be the beginning of the end. Aegis was the linchpin, the final barrier holding back the tide of war. If diplomacy failed here, the galaxy would plunge into chaos. "Admiral," another voice cut in through the comms. It was the voice of Captain Joran Kalos, the commander of the Union's ground forces on Aegis. "We've received word that the Zalor delegation has landed. They're being escorted to the negotiation chamber as we speak." "Understood," Selim replied, straightening his uniform. "I'll be down shortly." "Have the other Union delegates arrived?" "All accounted for, sir," Kalos said. "Everyone's waiting for you." Selim glanced at Thorn, who gave a sharp nod of confirmation. It was time. The admiral turned and began to stride toward the exit, his boots clanging against the steel floor. The weight of his duty pressed on his shoulders like a physical burden, but he bore it without complaint. He had been through worse. He had led men and women into the jaws of death countless times, always emerging victorious. But this was different. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about preserving the fragile peace that held the galaxy together. As Selim and Thorn made their way toward the shuttle bay, the crew of the Eos Primarch saluted in silent deference, their eyes following their leader with a mix of respect and fear. They knew what was at stake, and they trusted their admiral to see them through it. The shuttle bay was a hive of activity, with engineers and deckhands scurrying about, preparing vessels for deployment. The sleek diplomatic shuttle, gleaming in the harsh lights of the bay, awaited the admiral and his team. Without a word, Selim and Thorn boarded the craft, taking their seats as the engines hummed to life. The shuttle lifted off the deck with a soft whine, gliding smoothly through the magnetic barrier that separated the bay from the vacuum of space. Outside, the full might of the Union fleet stretched out before them, a breathtaking sight of power and precision. Hundreds of star ships, destroyers, frigates, carriers, stood in perfect formation, their weapon systems primed and ready. But as awe-inspiring as the Union fleet was, it was matched, ship for ship, by the Zalor Armada. On the far side of the planet, the enemy fleet lurked like a coiled serpent, its dark, angular ships bristling with weaponry. The tension between the two forces was tangible, like the calm before a storm. The shuttle descended toward the surface of Aegis, its sleek form cutting through the planet's atmosphere. Below, the negotiation site loomed, an ancient citadel of white stone, built millennia ago by a long-forgotten race. The citadel was a place of immense historical significance, its halls having witnessed countless treaties, alliances, and, on occasion, betrayals. It was fitting that the fate of the galaxy would be decided here, in this ancient place of power. As the shuttle touched down on the landing pad, Selim felt a pang of unease. He had been in countless negotiations before, but something about this felt different. The stakes were higher than ever, and the Zalor were not to be underestimated. The shuttle's hatch hissed open, and Selim stepped out onto the stone platform, his boots echoing against the marble floor. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the scent of the ancient forests that surrounded the citadel. Thorn followed closely behind, her hand resting on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at her waist. A group of Union officials awaited them, their expressions grave. At the head of the group stood Ambassador Nera Volaris, a seasoned diplomat who had spent decades brokering peace between warring factions. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her sharp eyes glinted with resolve. "Admiral Selim," Volaris greeted him with a nod. "We're ready to begin. The Zalor delegation has already arrived." "Then let's not waste any time," Selim replied, his voice firm. The group made their way into the citadel, passing through towering archways and long, echoing halls. The atmosphere inside was tense, the weight of history pressing down on everyone. Every step they took seemed to resonate with the memories of past negotiations, past failures. At last, they reached the grand chamber where the talks were to take place. The room was vast, its walls lined with tapestries depicting scenes of ancient battles and cosmic events. A long table stretched across the center of the room, and at one end sat the Zalor delegation. The Zalor were a striking sight, their tall, lithe forms draped in dark robes, their silver skin glistening under the dim light. At the head of their delegation sat High Chancellor Raxer, a figure of immense power and influence within the Zalor dominion. His eyes, a piercing shade of violet, met Selim's with an intensity that sent a chill down the admiral's spine.